think is going to be a very special episode. I have Michelle with me and Maria Francesca French. Am I
Yes,
pronouncing that correct?
yes, you are.
Um, she is a theologian. She is in the realm of post-Christianity. Her influences are Derrida, Caputo, and many more.
Hmm.
Her book recently came out called Safer Than the Known Way. I think this book is a very beautiful representation and sort of challenges our notions about that we need to break the circle.
Mm.
We need to find a new response because those same responses don't mean the same understandings that we could possibly have. And I
Mm.
think the book really captures that beautifully. So I'm gonna allow you to just sort of enter and introduce yourself, and then yeah.
Thank you. Well, thanks so much for having me on, you guys. I'm just really looking forward to this conversation that we're about to have, and can't wait to hear what you thought of the book. Thank you for that little eloquent, very eloquent snippet that you just said. So, as Javier said, my name is Maria Francesca French, and I am a theologian in the post-Christian realm, or post-theism, or post-God, or whatever sort of post-language you want to use. Essentially, I have a story that's not uncommon in terms of I am out of an evangelical charismatic background, and I kind of went through a lot of faith transition. And back in the day, we didn't have terms like deconstruction to describe some of all of that. So for us, and before I was evangelical charismatic, I was Catholic. I grew up in New York in a very entrenched cultural Italian American community, and that was our identity marker. And if you left that fold, you were called born again. It was that time in the 90s where that language was really circulating well and being used and employed. And if you deviated from that, or if you asked questions that you shouldn't have been asking, or anything along those lines, you were really considered, backslidden was a really popular term at the time. I was not one who strayed, quote unquote, in that period of my life. But as I moved through my religion, which was a really intense experience, because I was not only in the throes of conservative evangelicalism, I was also Pentecostal and charismatic. So, I was very much working in all of those spiritual gifts, engaging on a one-on-one level with the person of Jesus and prayer constantly. It was that Jesus and me story, purity culture, missionary stuff, evangelism, all of that every day, nonstop. And I went to a public school in New York. And then when I graduated, I went to Bible college in the Midwest. And then from there, I pursued seminary and some other interests all around ministry and God and Christianity. And then my faith just kept transitioning. So, it wasn't one day I was this and it all fell apart, and the next day I was that. It was for me a slow melt, but not in a devastating, full of grief way, in just a way where some things started to fade into the background and other things started to come into the fore. And I felt more free and more honest to be myself, and myself before God, or lack thereof. And I don't mean lack of being, I just mean lack of a certain construct of God. And then eventually, I checked the Pentecostal stuff at the door, and that was sort of left in my dust, not because I didn't agree with it or didn't enjoy it or it wasn't useful and fun and, all sorts of things. It just had lived past its sell-by date, and I was moving on from that. And then eventually I found myself progressive evangelical, and then I found myself post-evangelical. And then years later, I'm now using this language of post-Christian, which means a lot of things to a lot of different people, mostly in an atheist, secular sort of a way. But what I'm trying to do is introduce this idea of post-Christian as another way to engage Christianity after Christianity to a whole generation of people who are claiming deconstruction as their faith home at the moment. So yeah, that's sort of the nutshell of where I came from, and a little bit about me in terms of the places that I have been to come to write this book at this stage in my life. I mean, I can talk about boring stuff like my seminary degrees and doctorate and the work I've been doing the last decade in theological education, within the church, within all sorts of contexts. But a lot of it's in the book. So yeah.
So the way I'll frame this talk, so that way me and Michelle can juggle back and forth.
Cool.
Michelle, what we'll do is I'll ask a question, then Maria will answer, and then you can then ask her a question, Michelle. So this is what we'll proceed with, just to make it kind of smooth. So yeah, you bring so many themes to your book that I was like, wow. I mean, we could literally spend like a whole hour just on just that topic alone. That's the themes that you present. But what really stood out to me was this challenging of the dichotomy between atheism and theism. Right now I'm a religious studies major in the University of Arizona, and it's funny how still we're stuck in this paradigm.
Yeah.
So one, if you could just briefly kind of, mention, so how do we tackle this, dichotomy that you call, I really love this phrase, by the way, you said the theological stone age.
Yes.
So how do we tackle this this dichotomy of atheism and theism, and how should we start to look at that? Because I feel like your book really is like a biography theology. It's kind of like a memoir theology. It's I feel like you're capturing the emotional tone of, yes, we can say God is dead. However, there's still this sort of grieving, this process, this amongst the ruins, like you mentioned, where there is this, yes, I understand, but I'm still hurting. I'm still grieving. So how do we approach that? And I know your book answers that, but I'll let you go.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, you've asked so many good questions, and you've clearly read the book, so thank you for that. The whole theist atheist dichotomy was one that I didn't realize existed until I found myself between those two polarities and on that spectrum, sliding back and forth and trying to figure out where I fit. And I'm so glad that I went through it, because as I went through it, I could look back and say to myself, oh my word, so many people are here and they really don't know how to engage this. And it is a place of sadness, and it is a place of grief, and it is a place of, I don't know where I belong. And when we're only given these two choices of traditional theism, the God in the sky, the interventionist God, if you will, and also the atheist position, which essentially is a militant atheism and a new atheism, Richard Dawkins and, the anti-God squad and all those guys. And it's just totally unhelpful. It lived way past its sell-by date in the 20th century. It's old, it's tired, it's boring. And most people who, hopefully are thinking for themselves will look at a debate between, traditional theism and militant atheism and just be like, I'm so over this. Like, I'm past it. I'm sort of transcending this spectrum where notions of the being of God and the existence of God, this arguing back and forth like a ping pong match, and nobody's ever going to win. It's just sort of a dog chasing its tail. Like, people who really want to engage faith aren't so much concerned with these ideological positions and questions that can't ever really have answers. In fact, theism and atheism are answering questions that nobody's asking anymore. And I think when you go through a faith crisis, certain constructs of God and belief and doctrine and church and community and meaning making and all of these things, when they start to fall apart and all you can see on the horizon is, well, it's this or atheism, that is a really scary place to be. And, an identity crisis ensues, essentially, because when you're part of traditional understanding of Christianity and this sense that there is this God in the sky who looks out for you, who has a will for your life, who has a purpose and plan for your life, and that starts to sort of vaporize, if you will, and you're feeling alone and you don't know where to go with this, and all of a sudden you realize that you've built your entire self-understanding and identity upon a God that is now vaporizing and essentially, like you said, Javier, dead. And so I think to just have honest and authentic conversations about how unhelpful these polarities are, and that we are moving past them to have more meaningful and transformative and frankly useful conversations. I hope that answered that question a little, but you're right. It's something we can talk about for hours.
That was great. That was so great, Maria. Thank you so much. And yeah, I think a question that has been circulating in my mind has been about the voice of God. I've been thinking about that also because of something that Javier has been like we're talking about, and on voices. And I think that hearing the voice of God is a very unique thing to maybe even more so to Christianity than to almost any other religion, because of the concept of the Holy Spirit and the communication, and which is actually the communing with God. And so I guess I'm wondering how you would kind of speak to navigating personally for yourself, and maybe for others who are asking questions about this, how to understand hearing the voice of God in a time when we are keeping open, or the idea of post-Christianity is to keep open God or lack thereof, right? To the Caputo quote, right? The insistence of God.
Indeed,
from a non-existence, right? However, there's still that insistence. So could we call that insistence similar? I know we can't, the whole idea is to not kind of make similitudes and such, but can we liken that to the idea of the Holy Spirit provoking or convicting or speaking? What do you think, Maria?
Yeah, I have a lot of thoughts on this. Well, I should say I have a lot of thoughts and I don't. Because the Caputo piece you mentioned is amazing, and this idea that he unpacks in his book, The Insistence of God, is complex and beautiful, and really has to do with God only insists because we do. We insist that God is our name for meaning, or as John Caputo would say via Derrida, that God is the name or the noun or the language in which we house the idea of the event. But now it's become very domesticated and containable and knowable, and it's sort of lost its luster, to sort of put it a bit crudely. In terms of your question, the voice of God and the Holy Spirit and all of these things, I don't have problem with this language. It's not language I use anymore for myself in my own faith engagement. I did for a lot of years, but I just don't engage God on a one-on-one basis anymore. For me, that construct of faith, that way of practicing faith has come to its end, in a sense. And, people, one of the reasons why I said I have a lot to say about your question and I don't is because typically when people ask me about my own prayer life or what I think about Jesus or how I engage these things for myself, I tend to not answer them. And it's mostly because I think that some of these questions are actually a little superfluous to the actual point of Christianity. And even though we can house it in nice language, and you housed it really beautifully in terms of, well, how do we engage the Holy Spirit and how do we hear the voice of God? The crux of that question is still, how do we engage with what we cannot see, a metaphysical, supernatural, teleological, ontological being, in an individual way? And what happens there is, again, at the core of that question and some of that language, it's an undermining of the communal nature of Christianity. And I have a couple chapters on Jesus, and I talk about, what's the deal with Christian and post-Christian? Why do we have to be post-Christian? Why is it still important to engage Jesus beyond saviorism? And why is it important to engage meaning after metaphysicality? Is there a point? Is there a point to engage in Jesus if it's not on a one-on-one basis? Is there a point to engaging God if it's not a matter of metaphysics? And the answer to these questions is simply yes. So I guess I can't really answer that question well, because that is not where my faith is at the moment. And it's not something I place a high value on in terms of the language, hearing the voice of God, and sort of engaging with the Holy Spirit. I don't deny anybody else that sort of engagement. But for me, two things. I know this is a long answer to your question, but if I was going to answer it very simply, I would say, one, not the point of faith in Christianity. So that becomes lower down the rungs of importance. So again, someone can do this and engage faith and God and Christianity like this, but for me, it's definitely not in like the top 5 or the top 10. It doesn't really rate for me from a theological meaning-making perspective. And two, it's sort of a private matter. So, and I'm not saying that because I don't want to answer your question, but I think how we engage that still small voice, if you will, is a private matter. It doesn't matter so much on a communal level as it does on our own sort of individual playing field. So I don't know. Is that an okay answer for you? I know there was a lot of sort of complex crossing over that I did there, but
No, that was beautiful, Brianne. That was perfect and wonderful, and answered my questions precisely. And I wanted to say, like, when you talk in your book about Jesus, one of the things that I found very really important and powerful, basically, like this idea of not being able to have Jesus be everything you idolized Jesus to be. And that doesn't mean that Jesus loses value. It's that you understand the transcendence of that value in a new way, in a strangely unmetaphysical way, in a sense. But I love that idea so much, because I think it was a really visceral moment in reading that particular section of your book, because it made me think of how people would have actually really engaged with Jesus when he was here on the earth, because nobody would have thought of him as like, my Jesus, my savior, like nobody would think of him as that, right? They would be like, this man is crazy. We have to come to terms with what this man is doing and what he means, and what is the meaning of all that he did, in his life and in his death and resurrection, ascension, and all that you might believe about that. But I just felt this really interesting, it was a very interesting experience, Maria. So to your credit, you wrote that in a really beautiful, raw way that really kind of renewed an understanding of, like, kind of seeing Jesus almost like for the first time, or as if you're encountering him as you really would have been in his time on earth. So anyways, I just wanted to speak to that really quickly. And I wanted to say your answer was great, and really, I appreciate it so much.
Thank you. I feel like sometimes I give these non-answers. Do you know what I mean? Because I can't ever give a straight answer. And when it comes to matters of religion, and especially God, there really are no straight answers. And we've gotten used to the straight answers, and they're just, it's a difficult thing to do. But Javier, earlier you talked about the dichotomy I mentioned in my book between theism and atheism, but there's another dichotomy that really gets in the way when we're having Jesus conversations, and that's the plane of the conservative versus conservative versus liberal Christian. And this is where it gets sticky with ideas and concepts of Jesus, because if we can't sign on to the fact that he was and is the literal supernatural Son of God, then we just say things like, well, he was a really great moral teacher. He was totally human, died, didn't resurrect. None of that stuff actually happened, but we can look to Jesus for lots of really wonderful ethics and values and how to be human in the world. And when we bring in these matters of existence and being an object, we feel like we have to pick Jesus existed like this, or he didn't at all. And when we say, okay, actually, these empirical realities don't matter the way we used to think that they did, they aren't an accurate portrayal of how we feel about any of this stuff, what it means for us, that it's still a living thing that, we're going to be engaging kind of on a lifelong basis. We don't have to choose. And, we often find conservative Christians co-opt Jesus, and they give him values that look like them. So Jesus is muscular and carries a gun and, is like a warrior king, and he'll overturn the tables and he'll get in your face. And yeah, he died on a cross, but he's coming back on this white horse and he's going to win this war. And, wrathful judge, who will kind of sit at, the end of time and, send these people into this eternal torment if you didn't follow him. And then you have the liberal Christian that turns Jesus into sort of this really boring, wet noodle, granola eating, garden keeping pacifist hippie. Do you know what I mean? And all of a sudden Jesus is anti-racist and, pro GLBTQ and pro-immigrant and, all of these wonderful values that I share. Like, I am those things that I just mentioned. But we have to be very careful when we ascribe values to Jesus, even when they're noble ones. Do you know what I mean? And so, again, when we kind of get tied up in having to choose Jesus being a certain way or not, it's dangerous territory. And, if there's one if there's one among a few takeaways I want people to have after reading my book, it's that we need to tread on all of this stuff very lightly, very carefully, and with a sense of theological humility and hermeneutical humility. So again, that's why answers to your question for me are complex yet simple at the same time.
Thank you, Maria. There does seem to be this implicit danger, because I really liked your section on the impersonal Jesus, because it actually showed the danger of how once we make it personal, there's this risk of alienating everybody else because it all of a sudden becomes impersonal, right? So actually there's this play, a genius play in my opinion, where actually making it impersonal allows it to be personal. But we have to approach what is personable indirectly, because that is actually what allows everything to be inclusive, to actually have a sort of communal relation, a communal Christianity. Because I think gripping onto what we feel is personal is actually what alienates everybody else, is actually what makes it impersonal, right? That's like the sort of deep irony that I enjoyed kind of encountering with your book, and how we can look at Jesus the way we start to get frustrating with our loved ones, where these epiphanies where someone says, I don't even know who you are anymore. Right? That you're just a complete stranger to me. You've broken my notions about who I thought you were. And I think implicit within your book, it's this cry, this also kind of mourning, but also hopeful type of tone, where it's like, yes, keep Jesus a stranger, because keeping him a stranger is what allows the constant dialogue. It's actually what makes him more alive, rather than making Jesus as somebody that sort of sustains our identities. Rather, we can use Jesus as somebody that challenges our identities, that keeps it strange, that keeps it just as open as Jesus is a stranger to us. And I really like the scene of like the Bible where Thomas is like, Jesus is so strange to Thomas. He doesn't even believe it, right? He's like, oh my God, is this real? So I just want to hear your comments on
that. Sorry, did you say you wanted to hear my comments, or you? I think the important thing to remember is that it actually, what I'm not trying to do is go from one rigid understanding of engaging Jesus to another. So I'm not even saying you have to keep Jesus a stranger. I'm just saying on an individualistic level, let's not make our proximity to the person of Jesus, or who we believe the person of Jesus to be, a litmus test for Christianity. And typically traditionally it has been, and it's caused a lot of problems. It's caused a lot of crisis. It's caused a lot of people to leave Christianity when maybe they didn't want to, but they were being told, well, you have to believe and you have to engage like this. And if you can't, well, then, you're not really a Christian. And I just think that's really problematic. So in terms of our own proximity to Jesus, it's okay to be really close to Jesus if you want to, and it's okay to be the stranger and far away, and it's okay to sort of change that whenever the wind changes for you in that area of your faith or your life. For me, that proximity changed about several years ago. Maybe it'll change back, maybe it won't, I don't know. I know when you introduced me as a theologian, and I am of sorts, but I also do a lot of biblical studies, and I have taught New Testament, and I have done very regular preaching in church communities. So I have a love for scripture, and I have a love for the story of Jesus and what's happening there. And I have this amazing love and heart for people throughout time, space, and history for the last 2,000 years who have been turning to this person's story and making incredible meaning out of it. And very different for lots of people that meaning is. But there's something really beautiful about that to me. And I'm a part of it still, and I want to be a part of it. And that's what makes me and other people who might, choose this language of post-Christian. There's a reason why I'm not atheist or theist. I'm post-theist, I am allowed to still engage Christianity and Jesus and all of these things that have meant so many beautiful things to so many different people for millennia while being past it all and while having moved through it all. Could I have decided, I don't want to engage God or any of this anymore, and I'm just going to be totally done? Yeah, I could have. But why would I do that? Do you know what I mean? And I think a lot of people feel like, again, back to that dichotomy of atheism and deism, these are our only choices. We have to only engage in these two ways. And when they can't choose one or they don't want to choose one, they fall into like this weird abyss of sort of nowhere and nothingness. And that is where a lot of the identity crisis stuff happens. And, that really sort of breaks my heart. And that is sort of what motivates me to have done this work for the amount of years I've done it, and will continue to do that.
That was really great, Maria. Thank you for sharing. I love hearing your heart, and I think that what I'm hearing too, and what I've been thinking about lately, is how hard it is for us to hold space for difference. Like it's very easy to pay lip service. It's very easy to talk about difference and being different and the other, but it's very hard. It's very hard because you're simultaneously holding space and genuinely being open, but also holding your own place. Like you do still hold something. You hold, it's not as if like you're just you open your mind in a sense to be able to also close it sometimes too, right? There's always the bothness of that happening. And so being able to have some sort of ability to talk about what God or the lack thereof might mean for you, also is still being held in conjunction with there is difference. But it's very hard not to go into the difference land and then just let everything go. Like there's just just like it's just easier. We just kind of want one or the other. And it's very difficult to hold the tension place of the bothness. And so I think it's beautiful though that you're committing your time in your life to be able to really dig into the bothness and really go into those trenches and wade those waters, because it's very difficult. And I don't know if it's just our minds wanting like we can't handle it. We kind of just want it to be A equals A or something. We can't do the AB. And but I think there is something about, this isn't about like not having any type of anything that you have as meaning, right? It's about being able to be open to meaning that other people are still on a journey of finding and making. And I also loved your point about the litmus test. That's because again, just to think back about Jesus on earth would not have had a title, or like yes, he was given a title in like to mock him in his death, but like he was not. This wasn't Christianity, and Rollins does such a good job of speaking to that. And I think that that's something that is just, again, we're in this place of being able to find, like your book title, it's like safer than the known way. There is a way in which we as humans need to have something to call home, right? To have as some type of safety. We just survive from a survival perspective. We couldn't just be out in the wild days on end, and like I live out in the country, I know the realities of that. So it's like, we do need to have some sort of safety, but it's the safety in the unknown and in the uncertainty. But also that also means having different positions, right? We have certain things that we develop and are learning and are unlearning and relearning about what that home means, while we hold space for other people to have difference. So I just wanted to speak to that really quick. And it's just something that's been really on my mind a lot lately. It's just like, it's just so hard for us as humans.
Yeah, well, and as humans, we're kind of like addicted to knowledge. We're addicted to knowing, like, things have to make sense. We want there to be an ending to these stories, even if it means that we start new stories and looking for new endings. But it's not always that easy. It's not always like that. And I think that's why I've been so attracted to radical theology, because it talks about God as experience and event as opposed to object and being. That for me denotes total immobility, total, this is the story beginning and end, and in my book, I talk about being accused of a lot of different categories. I've been called anything from atheist and agnostic to a wolf in sheep's clothing to unorthodox and heretic. I've been called Christian atheist, and I've never grabbed one of those titles or categories for myself. People make their own judgments on me. But another thing that people sort of have said about, some of this type of conversation I'm trying to have is that it's a postmodern one. And I think what they mean by that is, there is no meaning. Everyone has their own truth. We're post-truth. What you want to think about things is, and truth is totally a la carte. It's just sort of like an anything goes situation. And for me, that is not where I'm coming from at all. If I'm postmodern, it's in the sense that I'm past modernity. Do you know what I mean? I'm past those very modern constructs of enlightenment and reason and scientific methods and formulas to figure out truth and fact from fiction and all of those things. So in that sense, I'm postmodernity, but I'm not postmodern in the a la carte of everything sense, because I am still working out of a meta narrative. For me, narrative is not dead. It's just been opened up, and it has just moved from a one-dimensional narrative to a three-dimensional one. And oh God, I just lost my train of thought. Sorry, you guys. I was just gonna say something else about that. But yeah, just going back to the radical theology piece, this is why I find that understanding. Oh, sorry. Now I know what I was gonna say. I'm gonna back up. So I was asked a question in the last year. I was presenting some of these ideas, a lot of Christian language, a lot of Christian understanding of theology and God constructs and things like that. And the question was, well, are you doing interreligious work? Are you doing interfaith work? Like, how would you, engage Islam or Buddhism or Hinduism or Judaism on any of these things? And it came across a lot unkinder. I just said, it was meant to be a critique of my work. And I just said, I'm not working in those paradigms. Why would I? Like, as someone who studied religion, sure, I can sort of give a nod to those understandings of God and religion by yeah, so they were asking me about, how would this work engage with other religions? And I said, I'm working within the realm of Christianity. Like, I'm really committed to, the Judeo-Christian story, the imperatives of redemption and restoration, and the concepts of making all things new that we find so beautifully and glaringly obvious in the New Testament. Like, this is the work that I do. So, of course, I would love to see all understandings of God be iterative and move forward into the future and, move forward into the 21st century for each respective community in ways that matter, in ways that aren't, pulling old ideas into the present and the future. But, Christianity is my story, and this is what I'm doing. So, it's weird. I'm in this, again, that's why, like, in the book, I say a few times, if you're feeling a little bit like you've fallen down the rabbit hole, in Alice in Wonderland, or if you feel like you're a guest at the Mad Hatter Tea Party, good, because that's how I want you to feel, And if you're understanding this part, but if you feel really challenged and confused by this, good. Like, you shouldn't read my book and be like, done, check, everything makes sense now. Like, things should make a little less sense, and that's a really good thing, especially when we're talking about realities that we're claiming are unseen, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I really liked your point, because it's almost like to engage in dialogue with other religions. I think you maybe indirectly pointing to this. It's like, how can we really engage in dialogue with other religions if we're perpetuating the same questions? If we're perpetuating the same old, dead questions? So then what is really happening other than a sort of just difference that's sameness? A difference that's disguised as the same. And I really noticed this a lot because I think your book captured this well when you're like having this conversation with this atheist, right? And he's trying to start the same conversation, right? He's like, yes, I know exactly where this is going to go. I'm going to prove her wrong. The Bible is incorrect. There's fallibility to it. And all of a sudden you just surprise him, right? You sort of break his notions. He's like, okay, I don't even know who I'm talking to anymore. kind of thing.
Yeah.
But I did notice something very fascinating in your book, and I was wondering because I wanted to ask you about it. Where you do this, I don't know if this was intentional, but I feel like it definitely, absolutely was intentional.
Okay.
It took me a while to capture this because I was like, oh, I just kind of just like briefly like, skim by it, not thinking much about it. Is when you spell being with a Y.
Oh yeah.
And I was like, oh my God. Because I'm still like getting into Derrida and Caputo. So it's all kind of really new to me. But I remember briefly reading just a little bit of marginal philosophy from Derrida.
Mhm.
And Derrida talks about, notice how I play with difference and
Mhm.
how there's a pictorial difference. And I was like, that's what she's doing. She's adding a pictorial difference to being. But this is like a very important point that she's trying to make. And I just wanted to point out, like, when I had previously talked about Stranger, what I really was trying to point out was like, you seem to capture or try to capture. I guess capture is a bad word, but it's more like you really tried to paint the picture for us that there's this excess, right? This excess of being
Mhm.
that cannot be captured. But to say that what that excess is
Mm.
also to be captured by what you think is that.
Mhm.
So I think your novel, like, I mean, your book really just challenges that. Like, you can almost feel the excess of it, where it's like, you're right. It cannot be just conservative and liberal Christianity. It cannot just be theism and atheism, because there's something that doesn't capture the excess of it. It doesn't interact with the excess of it. I guess that's
Yeah.
the better term.
Yeah.
Because to have a narrative is to, I think people think that there seems to be this ironic thing when we say God is dead, that actually it's not that God is dead, but we've forgotten that God is speaking in a sort of alive way.
Mhm.
And I think that you can find that in the Bible, where it's like the demand, the insistence is always changing.
Mhm.
It changed for the Jews. It was different for Moses. It was
Mhm.
different for literally every other prophet,
Yeah.
that insistence.
Mhm.
So when we're asking these questions, are we asking the questions in the context of what is actually being insisted?
Mm.
Because if not, then we're asking dead questions. And I think
Mm.
your novel is capturing that.
Yeah. You've said novel twice. I just want
I
to make
know.
sure our listeners know it's not a novel.
I know.
But it'd be fun to write a novel someday. Yeah, I mean, I think, you mentioned again the liberal versus conservative piece of Christianity, and I think this is why I bypassed progressive Christianity right up in my faith journey, and things I claimed as like, a Christian home for me. Denominationally speaking, I just passed progressive Christianity right up because, you know, progressive Christians are doing wonderful humanitarian work. There's a huge emphasis on social justice. I love all of it. But they are arguing for a kinder, nicer God, a God that is more good, a God that is more caring, a God that is more loving, a God that is more inclusive. And while I love all of these things, and as a human, I strive for these qualities myself, we're still talking about a God that has agency and personal being in the world. And these are this God's attributes. And again, the conversation I'm trying to have goes past agency and God being something that is an object and a being, whether it be in the world or in the sky or, ephemerally, spiritually sort of moving throughout the world. So I think that's where we just have to be careful in those conversations, if that makes sense.
Thank you so much for what you shared, Maria. I just wanted to ask a quick question on that with agency, because I was thinking a lot about agency recently. Had a talk with somebody on Gabor Mate's work, and he's like a psychologist and talks a lot about childhood trauma and things like that. And I there was this idea, and this is actually good. This will tie into like what the other question I was thinking about bringing up anyway, which has to do with agency and its relationship to fear. What I see a lot in your book is fearlessness. And I think that's really interesting because, if we think about like 1 John 4, where it's like, perfect love drives out fear. So fear is a very important thing to identify in our lives because it's primordial, but it also has to do with all of the things that are of our, the things that have to do with our, like, passion and things that light us up and all of that. A lot of times not facing that is, where we can dim ourselves a lot, right?
Mhm.
We make ourselves much smaller, in the Nietzschean sense, right? And I
Mhm.
think that, I guess for me, I'm wondering about this agency. Would you say that it has to do with kind of relating differently to fear, in a way that isn't so captured in fear itself? Because I think a lot of times there is a lot of fear that drives people in religion and Christianity too.
Yeah.
And there's also the concept of fearing God, which is never meant to be like, be afraid, be very afraid, but it can end up being that way, even though it's not intended that way. And so then it ends up just perpetuating fear, which is the very thing that I truly believe Christ came to shatter and make us
Mhm.
free from. And
Mhm.
and by allowing us to face it, that doesn't mean allowing us to just do anything, but it means what it means is to face it so that we can, in a sense, be everything that we are, right? So
Yeah.
anyways, I just wanted to ask that a little bit about like agency and fear, and how do you see that in a post Christian understanding, or working through it, or whatever, however we want to put it in that language.
Yeah. Do you mean in terms of relying on God's agency to sort of, help and ease our fear? Is that sort of what do we do with that now? Is that like
Yeah,
your
I guess.
question? Mhm.
Yeah, I guess that the thought is like, is it too much of just using the logic of the saying to say that, okay, the agency of God is now just going to be our agency? Is it
Mhm.
something where, like, what happens with agency, or what are you kind of provoking people to think about regarding agency and
Yeah.
fear now, in like thinking from a post-Christian perspective? So yeah, I hope
Yeah.
that clarifies.
That's a great question, and a lot of that is actually food for thought for my next book that I'm hoping to come out at the end of this year or early 2024. Because there is so much that we are leaving empty in our lives when we move on from traditional constructs and notions of God. There's matter of ritual. There's matter of all of those sacred things that we held as so hallowed and holy, and we put extreme importance on, whether that's going to church, whether that is taking communion, whether that is Bible reading and devotional time. We have these ritualized practices in our life, not least of which going to an interventionist God in prayer when we are afraid and when we feel alone and when we need courage and when we need someone or something to sort of prop us up and hold us up and give us strength outside of ourselves. I mean, typically this is why we have religion. When we're too weak, something else is strong, right? And that's biblical. For me, I keep thinking about your question that you asked me earlier that I sort of gave you a long non-answer for. Essentially, what do I do with the voice of God? What do I do with the Holy Spirit? Am I listening to that voice in some other way now? And what I wish I had said, which I will say now, or what I wish I had said in addition to that non-answer, was instead of listening to the voice of God, put that in air quotes, I'm now listening to the voice of those around me. I'm listening to myself and trusting my own intuition. When you're within the confines of Christianity, it's God knows best. And when you don't have the answers, this God does. And so you go to this unseen God in prayer and you get these dispensations of grace and courage and bravery for the journey ahead. And I did that for a long time. And I really felt like I was receiving those things. And at some point, again, it all started to sort of vaporize and fade into the background. And I found I was alone with no voice, with no being of agency outside myself. And at that point, you have to decide, do you want to keep doing that same thing, even though you know that this reality has changed and sort of that you can never go back to the way it was. And that is like a whole set of grief in and of itself for people, I think. Or do you want to engage your faith in another way, a way in which Schubert Ogden, who's a 20th century theologian, calls, faith that life is worth the living of it. Do we want to follow our own agencies and our own agency, our own imagination, our own intuition? Do we want to hear the voices of those who are right in front of us that we can actually see, that have a real presence in our lives, that are walking around, people who some of them know us better than we know ourselves. Maybe our spouses or our best friends or a sibling or someone who's mentored you. This is the idea, the communal nature of Christianity, where we can lean on that strength. Do you know what I mean? So yeah, do people go in prayer to an interventionist God that possesses, or that they believe possesses, agency and pray for those things? Sure. But we also get to, pray to our community and say, this is what we need. Can you help me? I'm not strong enough, or I am just whatever, not enough of. So does that make sense? So it's almost like not a transfer, because you're not going to treat your community or even yourself the way you would treat, what you believe to be the presence of God at one point in your life. But there is a sense that, okay, if I'm still going to be, I don't really like using this word, but if I'm going to still be religious about all of this in my life, then religion has to be about finding a way into the world rather than simply escaping it and getting out of it. And so, yeah, it forces us to look at reality in new ways. And that, I think, is always a good thing.
That was wonderful. Thank you, Maria.
Yeah.
Just to add on to those questions, it seems like this actually keeping it alive is actually staying with the question. Almost, right? Like one of my favorite poems from Rilke was this provocative, like living with the question. This sort of insistence to live with the question, because that's what keeps it, like as you say, the narrative, and that's what keeps it alive. And it does seem like your book is this cry for the vigilance of this insistence, right? That I think, if I could safely call this, that is the litmus test, to keep vigilance over this insistence, keep ourselves awake. And so to get more particular, you already answered the first part of my question with the impersonal Jesus, because I was very fascinated by that, because I was like, ooh, this really challenges like the more modern notions of Jesus. But you also talk about the resurrection and the cross.
Yeah.
And I really want some of my viewers to hear some of this sneak peek on the resurrection, the cross, because me and Michelle are in a lot of philosophy groups, and one of the things that are often attacked is like, well, yeah, we see Christianity changing, but Christianity still remains with the sort of same subatomic particles of resurrection and the cross and Jesus. So please, if you can expand on that for me.
Yeah. Big questions, the cross and the resurrection. I mean, we're talking like a 12-part podcast series here. When was it? Probably like 5 years ago now, Christmas Day. I want to say it was Christmas of 2017, because my memory is weird like that. I can remember dates. It was Christmas Day, and I was in the kitchen, and I was still in my pajamas. And I think I had like a t-shirt and big furry puffy socks on. And I had the New York Times Sunday edition, because Christmas was actually on a Sunday. And I was reading the op-ed kind of religion section. And there was an interview done with Tim Keller to appear in this edition, Christmas Day, New York Times. And the interviewer was asking him questions of the resurrection and the cross and the virgin birth and all of these things. Sorry if you hear the church bells, which is kind of amazing. That's Paris on the hour, every hour. And Tim Keller basically said, listen, if you don't believe in a literal interpretation of these events, then you can't really call yourself a Christian. I mean, these are the very basic things that make us Christian, is believing in the resurrection. I remember taking that newspaper, I smacked it down on the table, and the person I was with at the time was like, what? And I'm like, do you believe this? Like, this is why people can't engage Christian. This is why people just pass it right up. This is why it's not even worth a conversation. Like, this is not worth a conversation for me. Like, I do not want to talk to Tim. I don't really want to talk to Tim Keller about anything, but I definitely don't want to talk to him about this. And people who ask me, do you believe in a literal resurrection? I don't even answer that question. I'm like, that's such a non-starter. Don't you have anything more interesting to ask me? Not to say to you, Javier, I know that's not what you're asking, but just to kind of affirm your question. Yeah, this is not how we want to engage the resurrection. I mean, if you do, that's fine. But if we're trying to engage, because I would say the resurrection is certainly a pillar of Christianity, but it doesn't have to be literal. in order to be incredibly meaningful and super beautiful. And again, in my book, I have a couple chapters on Jesus, and one of those chapters has a section on resurrection. And, people have been writing about the resurrection, massive books for hundreds of years. So this is sort of my little drop in the bucket, mostly to just sort of spark people's imagination for something different. But when we really get into the eschatological understanding of resurrection and what it meant in exile and how this hope was birthed and the context in which it was birthed out of, and what it meant to apply words and themes and concepts like resurrection in the first century to the person of Jesus. There's a reason why, they didn't say, I saw Jesus's ghost, I saw Jesus's angel, I saw Jesus's spirit. There was a reason why when they used resurrection, everybody was shocked, because it meant something. So it had a theological reality attached to it that left any kind of empirical notion of resurrection in its dust, like just totally impotent and obsolete. And this I love, so that's just one little tidbit about why that can be so powerful in a way where literal fact or fiction doesn't even come into it. Like, we're not even asking that question, because that's not where the transformative power lies about this story here.
There seems to be this like, we can't assume that we even know what resurrection is, kind of thing.
Well, yeah.
And then there's this extra part where it's like, when you said, well, that's a non-starter, again, it's like this, like, are you sure that this is really what is being insisted, right? Are we really going to get stuck on, like, what is resurrection? I think a lot of, Christians that I've encountered, they still get like stuck on, like, even like the young kind of like philosophers that I meet that are interested in Christianity. They're like, oh, we need to rework resurrection. We need to make it believable. We need to make it prove God. And, like Buber, I think Buber was like one of my biggest influences. When he said something like, be concerned with your thou. I think it's crazy, because he doesn't even say, it says it's translated as thou, but thou is also has a kind of like, I don't even know what that is.
Mm-hmm.
And yet it's like creating a kind of like dialogue with this insistence.
Mm-hmm.
Be concerned with my thou. Yeah. Engage with my thou. Don't be so caught up in what other people's thous are. But ironically, it's like, if you engage with that thou, you can engage with other people. That is like the communal aspect.
Yeah. Well, and essentially that's, another word for the other. Do you know what I mean? Like, we all have our way of engaging with what is other. I think it's in chapter 6, I talk about new theological realities and new theological imaginations and what it looks like to play around with some of the stuff. And I talk about the work of Richard Carney in his book, Anatheism, essentially like a faith beyond faith, faith again, faith anew, all of this sort of after, I suppose, business. And he says, we have the word God, but more importantly, maybe we have the word and concept of stranger and guest and other. And he actually goes throughout scripture, both the Hebrew scriptures and the New Testament, and he talks about where stranger and guest and other show up and what the response is to that. And he calls us to, our own response to the other in ways where maybe we wouldn't have recognized that other, because we're too busy with our construct of the big other to sort of be concerned with those other matters. And, this is why I really appreciate radical theology. And this is why it's been my theological home for quite a while now, because it talks about God in terms of, the unknowable and the unnameable and the uncontainable. And I know that's tough, because it's a bit of it's definitely an apophatic way of using language and talking about God in theological terms. But as I say quite a bit in my book, like, language is so tough. Like, there's just no way that our words can accurately describe all that we are thinking and feeling and experience in this. Like, as humans, like, humanity is so beautiful and we have capacity for so many brilliant things. And to try and take words that are already obsolete and in the past, the moment we speak them, to try and house and communicate something that is so alive within us and ever growing, and ever showing up in new and different ways that just defy our own imaginations every time. It's just our best guess. It's just our best attempt to say, here's what I think and feel and believe and wonder and imagine and intuit about all of these things in this sort of little word or phrase. So it's, this apophatic way of speaking is sort of the best we can do. But, it's just, it's a way of engaging God after God. Jeffrey Robbins, who's also a radical theologian, I talk about his work a little bit in my book and open my first chapter with a quote that I heard him say at a lecture he gave in Belfast, and he said, and again, this was quite a few years ago, I want to say spring of 2016 or 17, something like that. But he said, a half a century after the death of God, we're still not done with the word God yet. And I'm not done with the word God yet. I'm done with what it used to house, but I'm not done with what it is about to speak of. And so in that sense, it's going from a big G God to a little G God. But there's once you start speaking about God in these ways, it's just limitless. Yet we can still engage the narrative of the New Testament really well and really beautiful with it also.
Michelle, I know you got to go, so if you want to give a last question to Maria before you go.
Yeah. Oh goodness. I don't know that I could I'm not sure that I would be able to be concise enough with another question, to be honest. So I will probably just have to take my leave, but I just want to say thank you so much, Maria. It's been a true honor and delight to speak with you and meet you. You just radiate, you glow, and I just love speaking with you. And it's just been great. Yeah. Great to talk with you. And, Javier and I have so many questions, and it was just great to be able to share some of those questions with you and get some great great feedback and perspective from you, and love your book, and I'm really excited for it to be out in the world and for many other people to read it. So Safer Than the Known Way, 27th, right? January 27th.
Yeah,
a
couple weeks.
Yeah,
Absolutely.
very exciting. So again, thank you both so much. Thanks for having me, Javier. Thank you, Maria, and thank you both for your time.
Thank you, Michelle. Thanks so much. This is great.
Absolutely.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. Bye, guys.
Bye.
Bye, Michelle. So I'll just try to ask one more question.
Yeah.
Because I thought this was an important one, because I know Caputo. I know Caputo and Derrida. I guess I combined them. Caputo and Derrida seem, well, at least Caputo anyways, makes this distinction, because I thought this would be an important one to, I think you say this in your book, if I remember. The difference between apophatic and radical theology. What is this difference? Because I know Caputo talks about how apophatic, typically the way it's understood, there seems to be this guise of sameness where really the way we apophatically speak about God is just really this sort of hyper presence.
Yeah.
And ironically, a lot of the work I've been doing, like a lot of my own work, I've been making this distinction between passion and desire. I think your book really captures what I've been arguing about passion, where passion is this thing that we encounter all the time, where it's like, that you're hungry, but you don't know what you want to eat. You don't know what that is, right? And there's just so much passion, and it's a kind of suffering, because you don't know what it is that you want to eat, but you know that you want to eat. And I think when you said, I am not done with God yet, it's that exact passion, because it's like, I know there's God, but I don't know what that is when I say it.
Yeah. But again, I think it's important to talk about what we mean when we say, I know there's God, or we're not done with God. And to be clear, Robin says he's not done with the word God yet, and he would probably interchange that with God. But again, it's that sense of, I'm not done with what we're housing in this little language unit. You know what I mean? Not so much, I'm not done with the person who lives in the sky, who I pray to and leads my life, and those kinds of things. That truly would be the death of God. And in terms of, and if some of our listeners are find themselves a little confused or unsure about this language of death of God, it's all in the book, but essentially it goes back to the 1960s death of God movement that ultimately goes back to Friedrich Nietzsche and his parable of the madman, and I won't go through it now because there's a little crash course on Death of God a few times in the book if you're not familiar, but that is where a lot of this stuff flows out from. So your question, the difference between apophatic theology and radical theology, apophatic is like, it's like an uncategory. You know what I mean? So again, you've got to be careful because you are talking about sameness. You're still sort of saying, well, it's not all of this, but it's still in a category, even if it's an uncategory. We're still kind of pitting something against each other. And, I love John Caputo has just done, his work has been absolutely invaluable, I think, to radical theology. And I know, Mark Taylor, I think, was the first theologian that really, tried to appropriate Derrida's work into theological contexts. And then I think John Caputo took off on that. But it's this sense of this ghost-like haunting and taunting and these whispers. And so we can call it an uncategory. We can speak about it apophatically, but we can also say it's just this thing. We can't even call it a force or a spirit or an energy. Like those are all still too small. It's this whisper that agitates us and interrupts us and it disrupts us. And according to John Caputo, once we're haunted in this way, once we give any kind of attention paid to this whisper or this ghost, if we don't pay heed to that, and if we try and ignore it, he says, we would fall in utter despair. It would be utterly devastating because it leaves us so changed and so spooked, to use Derrida and Caputo's language, that we're never quite the same again. And this idea of never quite being the same again, that's really religious language, right? That is, the way Christians talk about having an encounter with Jesus or having an encounter with God. But now we've just opened it up for, what Derrida calls l'avenir, which is the French word for to come. But it's not the obvious to come. There's a French word for that too, le futur. And that means what is immediately in the future, this very obvious thing that hasn't happened yet, but it is about to happen. We can see it on the horizon. We know what it is. It's very predictable. This is fine. L'avenir is this crazy, disruptive, magical, alchemy thing that we have no imagination for. And if we think we have precedent for it, then it's not actually l'avenir. It's this thing that's coming to us and leaving us at the same time it's coming to us. Then it comes to us again and it knocks us off our feet and it leaves us wanting more and it creates desire. But it's already gone and we will never have what we desire because we will never have that same experience with l'avenir again. And essentially, Derrida also uses the language of event and perhaps to describe these crazy meetings of us and life and the things that we cannot predict. And in the description of my book, I basically invite people into a read and a journey if you're prepared to move towards the horizon with no line and to follow a compass that doesn't point north. And I had two people who were editing this summarization of my book, and they both said, this compass that doesn't point north language, we don't like this. Just say a compass, in which we don't know where we're headed. And I was like, no. Because I had this image in my head of the very first Pirates of the Caribbean movie where Johnny Depp has a compass and it doesn't point north. And I think one of the admirals of the fleet or whatever his character name, he was like, you have a compass that's broken. It doesn't point north. You're the worst pirate I've ever seen. And it's like, no, actually the best pirate I've ever seen because you've got a compass that doesn't point north. And it's a sense of like everything we ever thought we knew is totally flipped upside down and subverted and just completely different than we ever thought. And not only different, because we can define different. It's past different. Take your imagination, stretch it out as far as you can, and then go even further if that is possible. And speaking of possible, again, going back to radical theology, speaking about God in ways that are impossible. Because the reality of God truly is impossible. But somehow we've made it very possible for God to exist.
Thank you, Maria. That was so wonderful and elegant and beautiful. I feel like your work really encompasses one of my favorite lectures from Derrida, and he even made an essay on this, where he talked about forgiveness.
Yes.
And he said forgiveness is for the unforgivable.
Yes. Yeah, I love that line he has. Yes.
Yeah, and that was something that I feel like your work really embodies, because it's like the logic of the same is like still haunting us, because I hear so much of the conversations around compassion and kindness, and yet I see that kindness is only for those that are kind. Compassion is only those for that are compassionate. And I'm just like, well, then what is compassion for if not for the compassionate? It's this haunting thing where it's like, I understand that we feel so different, apparently. I'm liberal, I'm conservative, and yet I'm only kind to the liberals because they're kind. I'm only kind to the conservative because they have the same idea as me. And I feel like, I really connected with your book because I get a lot of the same verbiage back to me. You're probably going to be like a heretic, pastor, preacher, whatever.
Yes.
And I'm like, no, I don't like those dichotomies anymore, because it just doesn't capture what the excess is like I feel. And I think it's no coincidence that I stumbled upon you, because I think as a Christian, these are exciting times. Like when I started encountering Derrida, Caputo, you, Barry Taylor, and Mark Taylor, and all these other figures, I'm like, my God, it's so exciting. Because finally, there is some. It's right now I'm taking a class on hip hop and God, and it's a kind of street theology that's emerging, where it's like, just because the ruins are there is something going on in the streets,
Yeah.
and I think it's really beautiful. And I think
I
your
agree.
book is trying to capture that beauty, and is also haunting us with that beauty. So I thank you, and I'll leave you for the final comments.
Thank you. Yeah. Well, I guess two things I'll say as a final comment, and you kind of just hit on it, the ruin piece. Chapter 2 is entitled Cathedral Ruins, and I found myself, so going back really quickly to what you said in the beginning, it kind of reads like a memoir theology piece. And actually, when I described the book, the very short pitch is, it reads part spiritual memoir, part theological manifesto. I didn't want to write just a theology book. I wanted people to understand my story, because I think, like I said earlier, my story is not an uncommon one. I think a lot of people can place themselves somewhere in my faith journey. And I wanted them to know that I'm coming to the table with all of this. So I'm not just some thinker in an ivory tower spouting off some lofty ideas, that I've actually lived through all of this. And this is what it has looked like for me. And I'm putting years of work and research and risk taking and all sorts of things into this book, as a gift, part gift to a younger me. I wrote this book. I wrote the book I wish I had when I was really alone, and I was starting at ground zero with a lot of this stuff. And I'm also writing the book for people who are where I was at or somewhere similar, who I think are really going to need this book. Obviously, the conversation on deconstruction, I mean, we've been talked about Derrida so much. This is a Derrida term. And so over the past few years, as this term has been used by pop culture to denote and define their disentwining and dismantling and devolving from a certain kind of faith construct, I was like, oh, this is interesting. Like, I wonder where they got that from. But, I wanted to offer deconstruction as it was actually offered by Derrida and since then, because I think to do actual true deconstruction is super brave and super risky, and there's zero guarantee of return on our investment into that deconstruction process. And I think what's happening now, and I don't fault anybody who is in the whole pop culture deconstruction pool at the moment, people are leaving the church in droves, and they're asking really good questions, and they're leaving for reasons that are super valid and totally make sense. But they're also reconstructing again, very quickly, and they want to engage faith in God. But again, this God is nicer and, just more tolerable and more palatable. And the idea of post-Christianity and the idea of building from nothing, because we can build, but there's just no guarantee that we're ever going to arrive at this place of togetherness and peace and nirvana of like, oh, this all makes sense and it was so worth it. And so going back to what I just mentioned earlier, the chapter 2 on cathedral ruins, I found myself, I was abroad for a year and a half in south of France. I talk about that in the book. I talk about how important France has been. I'm actually in France right now. I think I've said I was in Paris earlier. It's just been just such an important part of my life. And I was leaving to go back to the US to take this amazing job and start my doctorate and all of these things. And I was in Ischia, which is an island off the coast of Napoli in Italy. And I went up to this little island called Aragonese that was attached to Ischia by a walking bridge. And at the very top was a cathedral, because it used to be this medieval village. And there was a cathedral all the way at the top that was constructed in like 1300, and it was destructed somewhere, I think, 1800s. And I'd never been to a proper set of cathedral ruins before. I'd been to a lot of Roman ruins and all sorts of other ruins, but never cathedral ruin. And you could see where maybe there were windows, and you could see the stone altar that had completely broken down. The roof was off. I mean, it was just proper ruins. And I had this moment of like, this is what my life is. This is what the work is. To stand in cathedral ruins, metaphorically speaking, and figure out if there's anything that we will be building in these ruins. But we can only build anything. We can only even start to dream about rebuilding if we are among total ruins. And a little later in that chapter, I talk about Franco Berardi, who actually kind of came to his philosophical work in the Italian workers' movement. He's a workers' activist, and he started in the 70s. And he came out with this book several years ago called After the Future. And he totally indicts capitalism and consumer capitalism for the breakdown of the worker and the breakdown of the human, and the 0-hour work week that has totally disintegrated us from our work, from meaning, from community, from ourselves. It just fragmented our humanity. And he basically says, the promises of the 20th century, industrialization, modernization, capitalism, they had these unfettered growth fetishes that were completely unsustainable and completely unviable for the future. And all of those promises are completely broken, and our entire future has been blown up because of them. And we are looking at a future of broken promises and broken dreams, and nothing we can take to the bank anymore because of how this has irreparably broken it all down. But he doesn't stop there. He says, this is where our hope lies. This is our future. No future. And I quote the Sex Pistols in their God Save the Queen, no future for you. Like, you have no future, which is why we get to build it from the ground up, and we get to build it together in ways that are meaningful for us, and in ways that add depth and dimensionality and beauty and tragedy and all of these very human things to how we engage God and religion and community and the Bible and all sorts of things. So I guess I just want to end with that our future is so wide open in the most beautiful way. And it is okay to sit in rubble and ruin, and it's okay to cry. I think you sent me an email right before we did this podcast, and you said, I think I want to name it Crying in the Chapel, that or No More Circles. And I love both of those, because both of those phrases have been so meaningful to me. And, bless her heart and rest in peace. Lisa Marie Presley passed a few days ago, and such a sad and tragic thing. And I was very sad to hear the news. I've been, unbeknownst to a lot of people, and something I don't readily admit, but here I am on a podcast admitting it, I've been a lifelong Elvis Presley fan. I go in and out of my stages, but when I was a little girl, I used to dance with my dad to Elvis, and it kind of, I think, all started there, of course. And when I saw the Baz Luhrmann film, Elvis, this past summer, it just kind of reawakened so much sort of wonder and mystery about the life of Elvis and how he engaged civil rights and music and his life and creativity and all of these things. And I just decided that I wanted to listen to his hymns. I'm not a hymn person. I've never been a hymn person, even in like the heyday of my deepest, Jesus days, never a hymn person. But I remember he did an album of hymns, and I went to a coffee shop and I put my earbuds in and I started to listen to Crying in the Chapel. And again, I had one of these epiphany moments that I had years earlier at Aragonese in the cathedral ruins. And I was just like, this is what the post-Christian life is. Like, we are all just crying in the chapel because we have decided not to divorce ourselves from Christianity. We have decided not to leave it in our dust. We've decided to engage it after it. And in that sense, we're always going to be having this lifelong ache, these tears, both physical and metaphorical, emotional, mental, whatever, and grief for both the beauty and tragedy of like what our life has been, with religion, with God, without God, after God. For me, it really reflects the interior architecture of like our own longing. I know you and Michelle talked about you just talked about passion and desire. And it's the sense that this desire will live on. And this is why we can engage all of this and continue to engage all of it. And this is what we commit to. And this is all that we commit to. And it doesn't necessarily commit back to us, and that's okay. But this is why I named the book Safer Than the Known Way, because to step out into what seems like chaos, although I would argue that it's elegant chaos because of things like L'Avenir and Event, but to step out into darkness, to step out into the complete unknown, to fall down the rabbit hole, if you will, is still safer. And it still brings more of a sense of peace in the unknowing. And it still brings more of a sense of I am held, even though I don't know what I'm being held by. Maybe I'm being held by myself or a community, or maybe it's just my imagination. I don't know. But it is all safer. The unknown is still so much safer than all of that certainty I thought I had, which is actually completely unsafe. And I would go as far to say anti-human to live in such constructs of certainty. So there's a lot in the book, Javier, as you know, and I'm really excited to share it with the world.
Thank you so much, Maria. It's such a pleasure to talk to you, because like you said, it's like a hopeless hope, that the no
Yes.
future, right? The no future, and yet it's that kind of impossibility that sort of drives us. It's that passion, that it's so provoking, and it is this sort of beautiful fidelity to that passion, because it's like it's really like when somebody says to you, I love that you love doing that thing, right? It's just like, I love that you love doing that thing. Is that sort of acknowledgement of that? I love that you love doing that thing, and it's because like the person sort of acknowledges a sort of unintelligibility about why you love doing that thing. I don't understand why you love it, but I love that you love it, and it seems like if we could live our lives that way, this passion for this, like Saint Augustine said, I don't know what I love when I say that I love God, but I love that I love it. Or the way you quote Vatimo. It's like,
yes, I was going to say,
yeah, I believe that I believe. And it's funny because at first I was like, oh, I feel like I can almost feel like the repulsion sometimes people can have against that statement. Like, oh, you're just, whatever. But then when I started really thinking about that statement, like in a really deep way, I was like, that is really embracing the same passion we have for hunger when we don't even know what we want to eat. It's like, I do believe, but I don't know what I believe, but I believe that I believe. And that sort of like drives us forward to this no future kind of element. And I think your book is definitely a necessary step towards that transition, especially with grappling with the emotional kind of grieving side of it. And I definitely recommend to anybody watching this to absolutely listen to Crying in the Chapel while you're reading the book, because it has a sort of flavor and mood when you actually listen to it. I mean, I listened to it the moment you even pronounced it, and it gave that whole chapter just a tone of just. I automatically was like, I know what she's saying, but also don't know what she's saying, because there is this. I think the music, listening to the music, really kind of exaggerated that I didn't know what you were saying in that moment, and it was beautiful at the same time. You know.
Thank you. Yeah, I mean, it's funny. I don't know. I know a lot of people who are really angry with Christianity and with the church, and there's a lot of talk about religious abuse and religious trauma, and I hear that, and it's awful, because there is real trauma that's happening, and it's happening at really formative years for people, and their brains are adapting to that, and when they come out of it, it's just so tough. And people are angry and bitter, and I get it. And there's a time and a place for that, and people should be angry, and they should experience like that bitterness and that grief and that sadness. But there also has to be a place where we can come back around, and we can have a hope in, the no future. And I say that because, with the song Crying in the Chapel, it's not exactly theologically inclined or theologically on point. But we imbue the meaning on those things. And because it's almost like the word God, I can say the word God because I know what it is that I'm invoking when I say it. And we just have to be real about those things. I can come around to some of those very Christian-y things that I love or used to love and still love, but not in a nostalgic way where I, wish for the good old days or wish it to be like it was. But in a way, it's like I love cathedrals. I live in the UK. My husband's British, so we live there, and I've always been a traveler. I've traveled all around Europe, and my favorite thing to do is clock miles in really old cathedrals. And I can go into a cathedral and I can feel peace and I can feel beauty and I could feel such a love for just the incredible imagery and art and how people have depicted these narratives through different art forms throughout centuries. I don't go in there like looking for God. I don't go in there to pray specifically in a traditional way. I don't go in there to seek anything outside of myself. I know exactly what I'm doing when I engage that thing, if that makes sense. And so it's sort of a similar notion with Crying in the Chapel, but I just found it to be such a beautiful and moving metaphor for at least what post-Christianity has been for me. So I'm glad you felt that.
Yeah, I really did. And I appreciate your time so much. And just to say to the viewers, I think Maria's book, Safer Than the Known Way, is going to challenge those notions, but is also a hand in the dark, as you kind of quote in the beginning. And just to kind of play on the dark ages, I think you are welcoming us to the dark ages. And that there is a safety to that. There's a beauty to that we have now entered a sort of new dark age, but it doesn't have to be so riddled without hope. There is definitely a safety, beauty, elegance, like you said. So I really appreciate your time. And thank you so much.
Yes, this was wonderful. A great conversation. Thank you so much for having me.